You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focused podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 502 of the Foreign Policy Focused podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He's a staff writer over at RT, frequent guest on the podcast. I think 3 of the last 4 now. We have bylines together at the Libertarian Institute and Consortium News. He also has bylines at antiwar.com. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kyle. How you doing?
I'm all right. I gotta say I'm a little tired. It's been a crazy couple of weeks on top of a crazy couple of months, especially I think for people who observe the news cycle like me and you do and really try to not only find out all the little truths to all the different stories, like people tweet out a video here and there and they're like, oh my God, this is going on. Taints on the streets of Atlanta. And, we really take the time to drill down and find those things out. And there's so many of those stories right now. So I think we have a lot to cover on today's show and a lot to say. But overall, I gotta say, I'm feeling a little bit exhausted. It's been a crazy couple of weeks. How do you feel about first having this? We started doing these shows on Monday, like I think 3 months ago, and it was right when the coronavirus thing was really picking up. And I felt like that was a crazy news cycle time, and then this has completely surpassed that. So I don't know, just maybe what's your general feeling of things right now?
Yeah, I definitely feel you on the feeling of fatigue sort of with trying to keep up with all this stuff. I mean, over the last week, it's just it's become, these events that started in Minneapolis with the protests that eventually became rioting and stuff, that even was sort of a lot to follow in just the one city. But now it's been in all 50 states. There's I think protests in 12 different countries. It is becoming very fatiguing to try to stay on top of all this stuff. And at some point, I think it is sort of impossible. You can't follow literally everything. But when there's more than one of us, I guess we can kind of spread out our focus a little more.
Yeah, so maybe that's one place to start is just last Monday when me and you did our show together, we really spent, I think, the whole hour on the show really talking about the George Floyd protests and then the repercussions and consequences of that. So a lot has happened in the past week. There's a lot of, like I said, little stories to talk about, but maybe start off with, as far as you've seen, Will, what is the scope of the protest? And I don't see this really, at least the protesters just showing up every day. Thousands of people in several different cities, like you said, overseas, especially as we're recording this on Sunday, there were large protests in Germany, France, and the UK, including protests in the UK that led to, taking down of a statue, I guess, of somebody who was a slave trader or was related to the slave trade. There was the defacing of Churchill statues, calling him a racist. The same thing with a King Leopold statue, in Berlin. And so there's just so much going on around the world. And I guess I would have never thought that this was the type of protest movement to go international. Just because it's specifically about U.S. police violence towards our citizens. And I guess whenever I don't speak, French or German, but, sometimes I click the translate button, and I think Google or whoever, Twitter, does a pretty decent job translating. But at least with the UK ones, they're not chanting like Americans stop killing our own citizens. They seem to be heavy, generally displeasure with their own government and some policies there. So I guess, yeah. And then maybe tack onto that is, what do you see as the cohesion of the movement? Is it around Black Lives Matter? Is it around defund the police? And then I guess, especially in the latter days, I've started seeing more and more signs that are less related to maybe Black Lives Matter, some more socialist type causes like Medicaid for all, or, just looking more towards libertarian solutions of making the government smaller. So I'll go ahead and let you jump in here, Will. And I don't know. I kind of asked 4 or 5 questions there. You try to answer whichever one you want, and we'll try to get through all of it and hit all the important points here.
Right, sure. So, in terms of like the scope of the protests, I mean, like I was saying, it's kind of like it got to a point where I could not follow every place. Like earlier on, I was trying to keep a list of the cities. I came up with like 38 cities, but then as the week went on, like it became like hundreds of cities. I think it was the last I had seen, it was like 400 that somebody had counted in the U.S. Protests of varying sizes. Obviously, not every single one is a 1,000,000-man march or something, but there've been demonstrations and actions in lots and lots of places right now.
And just to add, in places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or Topeka, Kansas, not, when we say cities, you think of New York, LA, or even Indianapolis, St. Louis, cities that are quite a bit smaller, but are still, actual dots on most maps, where Topeka, Kansas wouldn't be if it wasn't a state capital, and Sioux Falls probably doesn't make it on most maps. So, very interesting on how widespread it is, and how I guess it's gone to these very, very much smaller cities too. But I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess we could say towns and cities, like hundreds of towns and cities. The international protests, I have not watched those super closely. Like I did see some stuff in the UK where they were getting a little bit rowdy, and I think earlier today, even in Sweden, there were some people like smashing windows and rioting and stuff. So this has definitely spread well beyond the United States. And when you look at, like France, for example, like we know France has had their own sort of like ongoing protest movement, the yellow vests. And so I think that's sort of like, that's similar in a lot of other countries. Like they already have sort of their own thing going, and this just sort of feeds into that. They're just like using this as sort of like a springboard to continue, protesting for what they were already protesting for. But it is definitely true that, the United States is not the only place with problems with the police. Like here, I think it is particularly bad. There are a lot of stories where people are getting killed. And there's sort of like a racial component that gets a lot of play and attention here in the U.S., which might not quite be the case in Sweden or something. But I know people do have similar grievances with, the community's relationship with the police. Like people are mad about that all over the world. It's not just, here in the U.S. But it is very interesting to see how sort of people use this George Floyd thing as a springboard for their own issues. And as this goes on, too, I think you do see sort of a broadening of scope. Like you see people bringing in more, discussion about Medicare for all, things like that. Like they're widening sort of this beyond police brutality. And I guess if you were to listen to what some of these like more left-wing activists say, like, they would say this isn't just one issue. Like, they talk about all this racial injustice stuff. And so they say this is all, the whole system is, needs to be reformed. But I think that does sort of become a problem. You start to lose your focus. And like, if we want legitimate, police reform, and we don't just want the mayor of DC to paint some words in the street or something, like you have to kind of keep your eye on the ball and maybe, not, let this expand and become, just this general social change thing. Like I do think we should stay focused more on specific, things we can do to rein in the police. That is the major issue here. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see sort of like how seemingly coordinated these things are, like, just how many cities this is broken out in. And you really hear like the same chants and a lot of the same sort of sentiments being expressed. Some of our friends, I think, have speculated a little bit that there is some more like, sort of like plotting going on behind the scenes where this is more centrally planned. But I think it also could just be like a genuine expression from a lot of different people that people are finally starting to really agree on this point that like, police are out of control and need to be reined in, I guess.
Right. Well, and I guess part of the story here that we haven't talked a lot about, and that doesn't get talked about in the news, that was dominating the media cycle like hardly anything ever before, it is COVID. And so I think that's had a couple effects. One, I think for people who have observed what has happened, as far as suddenly it's okay to go outside and protest. I'm not saying that people shouldn't go protest police brutality or for Black Lives Matter, or, whatever you want to go out and protest for. But before, this was equivalent to suicide, murdering nurses and doctors and everything. And suddenly now, they're saying that there's not a high risk involved with going out and protesting. And so, that's confusing, just because if COVID really was as bad as you said it was, and now you're telling all these people that it's not that bad and that it's okay to go out and protest, well, that's gonna get all of them sick with a terrible disease. So, there's either that issue or it wasn't a big deal all along and they just annihilated the American economy and get tens of million people out of their jobs for absolutely no reason. So it seems like, there's that real issue there. But, going from the other side, I think, maybe one reason why it feels like the protests are lacking direction is because there's a lot of people who are out at the protests to be outside. And I'm not saying that maybe they don't generally support the Black Lives Matter cause and agree that police shouldn't be killing black people. But maybe if life is going on as normal and, you got a job and you're busy and you haven't caught up on anything in a while and, you have a lot on your plate. So it's nice to just spend a Saturday at home. Whereas everybody's been trapped inside. So maybe this is like, I think adding to the number of people who are going, because when I've seen some of the videos of the protests, it does seem like there's some people there just hanging out. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I don't know, maybe there's a component really to that too, of just everybody being locked up, and this is now the one thing you're kind of allowed to do to go outside.
Yeah, I definitely think in one way or another, like the lockdowns and stuff have to play into this a little bit. All these people, millions of people cooped up all across the U.S. And not only the U.S. too. I mean, there were lockdowns in France and all kinds of other places too where there have been protests now. So I definitely think that has to play into this in some way. Even if it's sort of more subtle and it's not like the main driving thing. Like I do think that has some relation here. And it is kind of interesting. Dave Smith is making this point about like, it is sort of convenient that this huge story has now come, because if it is the case that, I don't have like a super strong opinion on this. I'm not absolutely certain that they way blew it out of proportion, but I do tend to think that, this virus, they did exaggerate a little bit. And so it is sort of convenient now that this big, this other big story comes and overshadows it, because, if it was unnecessary to shut down the economy and stuff, that's kind of a big deal. Like they put a lot of people out of work. They caused a lot of disruption and problems that will probably be with us for years to come now. I don't think this is just going to get better immediately. Some people are talking about a looming economic crisis that like might get way worse, in the coming months. And so that is sort of convenient that the alarmists over the lockdowns and stuff like that, they now have this distraction. But yeah, I think in one way or another, the COVID thing definitely, plays into these protests,
Right. Well, and then just talk about, and I've seen some articles on this about the down the line effects of COVID with disrupting the supply chain is going to cause this much more poverty with this many more people being out of work. So that's going to be, just an uptick in general mortality and suicides. But, when you go and look further and beyond and like, to the, really impoverished countries of the world in places, where people are really struggling and, starving on some kind of level, this is going to disrupt those supply chains even more. And so it's really going to hurt those people, not to mention that, everybody recalled their citizens from overseas. So all the, different kind of aid work that was going on in a lot of other countries has been put on hold and disrupted as well. So there's a lot going on, and I think a lot of down the road effects, but maybe that's a conversation for a different show, Will, especially once we get more information on how the virus has or has not spread through the protests. They say it has a 14-day incubation period, and the day the show is running will be the 14th day since the murder of George Floyd. So that should, we should start getting the data within this next week, whether or not, what's happening with COVID and if it's spreading. And that'll be very telling. And there'll be a lot of, I think, very important conversations to have about the data that we got here. That is almost one reason I'm surprised that the protests were allowed to happen, was just because it's going to give a really good case study on what happens when everybody goes outside and gets together. So let's talk. Here's another thing that I just wanted to mention. General violence and death. Over, I think, the 2 weeks, there's been something around 20 deaths that are, loosely associated with the protests. I mean, crime goes on in the U.S. every night. For anybody who's lived in, I would say, like the St. Louis or Detroit media market, Chicago, like news, like kind of area, will know that it's not uncommon, to be watching the news on a Saturday or Sunday morning and for them to be talking about 2 or 3 homicide scenes, if not more. And so, these things happen in cities where the protests are going on. And so it seems like there's like 4 or 5 of these at least that I'm not quite so sure that have actually anything to do with the protests or the riots or whatever you call them. But at least there's about 15 people who have died. There's a couple unconfirmed stories where there's reports of a young lady being sprayed in the face with some kind of tear gas or mace and having like an asthma attack, and just a tragedy of like kind of just terrible circumstances leads to her dying. It doesn't seem like there's any clarity yet from the shooting outside of I think a barbecue place. Where was it? In Indianapolis, where this guy, I remember his nickname, Mr. Barbecue, not his actual name, seems to have been killed in an event he wasn't related to in fire from authorities. And so I don't know if you have anything else to add to that or any more insights there.
Yeah, I have seen some of these stories where it's like, there's an act of violence. Sometimes, somebody either hits a police officer with a car or shoots on them or something, but it's not always totally clear that this was linked to the protests. Like you said, I live around the Metro Detroit area, and yes, it's very common to see stories of shootings and stuff. It's just when they can be possibly linked to the protests, then it becomes like, it might actually grab national headlines. And so, some of these cases, it's not totally clear they were related to the protests. In some cases, it actually might be related in the sense that there are just more police on the streets. There's a greater police presence. And so someone who might shoot at the police anyway might be more likely to do so under those conditions. But yeah, I haven't seen I've seen plenty of violence, certainly of, like beatings and there's the looting and rioting and stuff. But it doesn't seem like things escalated really intensely with the police to where people are, there was that story in St. Louis where there was a shootout and stuff. But again, we don't know, like, I have no, indication. I haven't really looked into it super deeply, but I had no indication that those were like protesters or, militant political people like that. I think that may have just been like unfortunately a run of the mill sort of a shootout in St. Louis there. So,
right. And I know there are definitely some St. Louis, I'm from St. Louis, so I have some St. Louis listeners in the audience, and, they won't really disagree with that there's, quite a lot of gun violence in and around the city. I would say, I guess, mostly between, fellow citizens, but at times the cops too. One of the other things I had just noticed is general conflict between police and protesters. There's a thread on Twitter, and I'm going to find to it and link to it. It's about now up to 400 cases of police violence against protesters. They range from people being unnecessarily arrested and them going fairly peacefully, so they just get thrown around a little bit, to police officers firing, I believe they were pepper pellets and tear gas canisters at a car with a pregnant woman. So the I guess amount of violence, that you could find there has quite a range. I was able, to really click through and drill down on quite a few of them to say that, this actually happened in this city, during the George Floyd protests, as it says. Some of the more horrific things that I'm seeing are police driving around and just macing entire crowds of people from inside of vehicles. This is extremely dangerous. This could really, set off like different medical, emergencies with different people, and just to use this so discriminately against people you have no reason to use it to. I mean, it is general assault, and I feel like you could slap some attempted murder charges against these cops on that kind of stuff. Then police using their cars as weapons has been fairly serious. Something I saw that was highly disturbing was a woman was arrested by an officer, but the officer only had one badge displayed and otherwise was dressed in black clothing, and put the woman in an unmarked car. It looked actually like a rental minivan, and I don't know. That's almost a kidnapping. I mean, I think it is a kidnapping, but even by today's standards, that it seems like quite a kidnapping to me. Will. Then there's this article in The Intercept by Trevor Timm. The U.S. Press Freedom Foundation looked at over 200 cases of violence against the press during these protests, and they found that over 80% of the time the violence was coming from police. And so I guess the final trend for the week, I'll say, is that it seems like police violence has initiated a lot of the larger confrontations and looting and rioting, and that an overwhelming just amount of violence in general is committed by the police, and that the violence against the police, targeted at the police, has been far less and lower.
Yeah, I certainly agree that I've seen countless cases where it does seem the police really do escalate these protests. People are sitting there and then one cop decides to shoot tear gas or shoot a pepper ball at somebody, and then it really incites the crowd, and then people then turn around and do some unjustified things. They break stuff and riot and stuff. That's not in every case, to be sure. You can't always just blame the cops, but there are a lot of cases where police do this. And that is just sort of the overall problem with police in the United States, I think, is that they are constantly unleashing force on people when it's unnecessary, escalating situations into greater violence to where it does, end up with people getting killed, like George Floyd and all these other stories we've seen. And so I think we're seeing that play out even in the protests as well, where the cops still have this sort of mentality where, escalate until they get what they want. And that doesn't always, have the best outcomes. It can, be chaotic and violent.
Right. I guess just to express a little bit of understanding here too, from the police officer's perspective, and especially, whatever guy is just on the street, I don't think maybe this guy planned, when he saw himself being a cop, saw himself being dressed as a stormtrooper in front of, a crowd screaming at him. And I think to always remember that the police officers are the paid enforcers of the government. And, there's a lot of people behind them that benefit a whole lot more from this system than the police officers, that are, raking in the money and just using the police officers as a front and a sponge, for the people's anger, rather than them having to be held accountable for their policies that they have the police officers enforce. And so, while racism is a problem, if you're sending police officers into black communities less, then hopefully you have a whole lot less of these, George Floyd type situations anyways. And we've seen this to be something that happens. You send the police officers, in the communities, especially on these nonviolent crime, looking for weed and stuff like that. You have less of the violent confrontations and less people getting killed. And so it's not the police officers, although they may at times support the drug laws, they're not writing it. They're being told to go out there and enforce it. And so we always have to remember too that, there's a lot of very evil people behind the scenes.
Right, certainly. Yeah, the cops are not the full extent of the problem. There's a whole there's a criminal justice system as well of what happens after people are arrested and have to deal with police. That, is a major issue as well. And then legislation and, a lot of other things that you pointed out too. So yeah, it's not just the cops. Certainly there's a lot of other, things to address. We can't put the full blame of this whole situation on cops, I think.
Right. So, all right. So there's a couple stories from the past week that I really did want to talk about because I think it's being reported wrong or misreported. And they're just, this first one is tragic. You have this 75-year-old man who, I don't know, maybe you could tell me if he was a protester or not. I guess he was walking kind of through a police line as they were marching forward. I'm not even joking. The police officers here, the way they carry those batons are like the droids from Star Wars, and I think have about as much critical thought as they're, acting like the battle droids out there. This old man gets in their way and they push him to the ground. He goes down, he hits his head, he starts bleeding from his ear. And this is a 75-year-old man and an old 75 too. This is the kind of guy that the way he walks, you could tell that if a strong gust of wind comes over, you may have to help keep him upright. And so pushing him to the ground, unbelievable. And then the officers just continue to march on. Like one officer kind of goes to lean down to help him up, or who knows, maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Maybe he's going to swing and hit the guy in the head again. But gets pulled away by another officer and they march on. And I don't even think it's still guys in fatigue. So I'm assuming National Guard come up, that anybody even helps this old man. But then tell us about the fallout from this, Will.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, as you said, this old man gets pushed to the ground. He starts bleeding from the ear. And it did look like he was like walking up to the cops. It looked like he was pointing at their batons, sort of like, hey, what are you guys doing here? Like, don't have those weapons out. Like, it seemed like he was trying to chastise them, but he was not making any threat to these officers. I mean, just to see this guy, like you said, he looked like a frail old man. And to see these officers like fully clad in riot gear and armor and have their clubs, and they have an overwhelming number of officers there. And another thing, too, it wasn't as if there was this big, angry crowd right next to them. Like, it seemed like they had mostly cleared the crowd away, and it was just this one old man and a big crowd of police officers. So it is kind of outrageous to think of this old man as any kind of threat to that huge crowd of officers in their armor and all their weapons. But yes, after this group of officers pushes this man to the ground, video of the incident, kind of goes viral. It's sort of a horrible, disturbing footage to see the guy bleeding out of his ears and stuff. And the two officers who were like most involved in pushing him, I guess, they were both I think they were definitely suspended. I don't think they were fired, but suspended from the force. And following this incident with the suspensions, there was the whole emergency response team, which I guess is like the whole riot squad there. It was like 57 officers decided to resign from the response team, at least. I don't think they quit the force altogether. And you can clarify this next part here, because I actually wasn't fully aware of like the whole situation, because I had read the police union said that these 57 guys resigned in as a show of support for the two officers who were disciplined, and as a show of disgust toward anyone who would dare to question their actions, I guess.
Right. That was the initial story put out. And right. I believe it was from the police union that we got that. And then they got statements from the actual officers. So, maybe that does represent a portion of the officers. But I read statements from, it seemed like 3 different officers. It was hard to tell because they were unnamed, but they seemed like they were different statements. And essentially what the officers were saying was they didn't understand why the union represented it like that. And it was essentially, I guess, maybe a decision from the city. It was unclear to me who made the decision. But essentially, they weren't going to protect, these officers from prosecution, because I believe they're facing 2nd-degree assault charges now. So, they basically said, well, if you're not going to protect us, we're not going to do this job, which is in a sense, I think, what needs to happen insofar, as police officers are going to listen to this and think about what to do. If you're asked to, do things that are wrong, don't do them. Maybe it takes your bosses telling you they won't protect you anymore when you're doing things wrong for you to stop doing it. But that seems to be what happened here. And so I guess it's disappointing. It was reported that way initially because everybody, including myself, shared it around social media. I mean, the police union seemed to be speaking for the police. But potentially that isn't what happened, or at least not all officers felt that way. And basically they felt they had, lost maybe their privileged status and protection. And so they say we can't do that job with that. And I guess that's, just the kind of important insight into policing is that if they feel like they can't enforce all these, laws and all these different policies, policing policies that politicians want them to, without the ability to, act recklessly and violently against, the people they're enforcing them on. So, maybe that is just a representation that we really need to relook at the way, policing's happening. And I guess that could, bring us into this next conversation I have, which is the Minneapolis Police Department may be disbanded. There is this viral clip going around where I guess it's the mayor of Minneapolis is standing in a crowd, and I guess I'll give the guy a little bit of credit. He was standing in the middle of a very hostile crowd. And I'm not saying that, these people were savages and were going to rip him apart or anything. But like if somebody threw a rock at him, there wasn't anything he could do. He was standing a lot of people that didn't like him. And they were basically asking him if he was going to disband the police department. And he said no. And I guess it's being reported today by, I believe, the New York Times that there is a majority-proof group on the city council of Minneapolis that is going to push forward a plan to disband the police department. However, this is important that most people forget this. It will keep the sheriff's office in place. So it's not like there won't be armed, kind of representative of the state with a monopoly on violence in this area. That will still be the case. However, the police department will be disbanded and the sheriff is elected. And so there is some more accountability to the police. And then all the police department money is going to be filed into community programs, including a mental health response team, which I think is something that is actually going to like make a meaningful difference. A lot of people who are killed by police officers, one of the things that happened is there's like this distinction between armed and unarmed people who get killed by police officers, whereas anybody who is killed armed, like their life is forfeit. You were armed around an officer, you really don't. The way the media has got reported, you don't have much of a say. Well, a lot of these people are in the middle of a mental health crisis and considering killing themselves, and the police show up and just finish the job for them. And so having a team of people out there to respond to this crisis would be far superior to police. And I could kind of say that because that was somewhat my professional job for a while, that would be huge. That police have absolutely no idea how to deal with somebody in a mental health crisis. At best, they're going to go and try to, apprehend them non-lethally. But a lot of times the people are acting so irrationally that the cops are afraid to get close and, just kind of stand their ground, until the standoff escalates to the point where, the person is threatening, and somebody who's paranoid and is surrounded by police is only going to continue to get more and more paranoid, especially uniformed officers with guns. And so, this is one of the big crises that we have in this country. And hopefully, so it looks like there's some things in here like a drug program that are real steps in the right direction. And I don't know, are encouraging, but I'll kind of let you weigh in on that. And I know we only have scant details of this, and I don't know the makeup of the Minneapolis City Council. They're probably all corrupt. And so maybe the mental health program goes nowhere because, somebody's brother's psychologist, and that ends up means they're in charge, and nepotism is incompetence, and it never goes anywhere. So I'm not saying that like this is going to be great and the town is going to be better without police, but there are, I think, some positive things here, and it is interesting to see the Minnesota, especially black community, so exasperated with the police department that they're willing to just say goodbye to it completely. And that maybe that's where we could start with your point, and then you could go from there. Is I know you have a couple stories of things the Minneapolis Police Department was doing that are shocking stuff. And so maybe this will help people understand why that community is so tired of their police.
Yeah, sure. So, like as you said, there's been sort of this call for a while now, actually, to actually outright disband the police department, the Minneapolis Police Department. This has mostly started among like activists, a lot of left-wing groups and stuff. But as you said, more recently, this is getting traction in the city council itself, and with people who are in positions to make this kind of happen. There've been proposals to do away with school resource officers and stuff like that. The cops that are working in high schools, because this often means people get pulled into the criminal justice system while they're teenagers. Creates all kind of problems later in life. But this more radical proposal now to outright disband the police department is getting traction. Last week, you had the councilman, Steve Fletcher, publishing an op-ed in Time magazine where he sort of makes this case, and he lays out that, they should, dissolve the police department and replace it with some kind of like nonviolent emergency response team kind of thing. And there have these other proposals too, as you were talking about, bringing in trained mental health professionals to deal with people in crisis, and to have more like medically trained people come and respond to drug overdoses. Basically, people who aren't going to show up and start imposing violence on people in these situations where it's not necessary at all. Especially like you're saying with the mental health crisis, like that's a very fragile situation. And there's way too many times where cops just show up and just start, shooting people or tasing people. And it often does lead to death. And so part of the argument here behind this whole push is that they've tried all kinds of reform in the past. They've tried to change how officers are trained. They tried to, make personnel records more transparent, to cut the department budget, things like that. But because the cops are so powerful, because they have this police union and their lawyers and all this political influence, The argument is basically that they have diffused and stopped all meaningful reform, all change to how they might actually operate. So people are just finally saying, like, we just have to get rid of this thing and start fresh. There've been quite a few, previous stories that have risen to prominence that have, led people to criticize this police department, and that people are now sort of raising again. We've had, prior shootings of unarmed people like Jamar Clark and Philando Castile, sort of unjustified shootings that have caused big, protests and anger in the past over the last 5 years or so. I think the big paper in Minneapolis, the Star Tribune, they've actually tallied up 150 police killings in the city since 2000. And those are just some of the ones that they were actually able to find and verify. Like a lot of those cases, they said that the records sort of like the death records obscured police involvement. So there's a lot of cases where they just might have missed it. Like we don't actually know that this guy did die at the hands of police. But, in some of those 150 people, maybe they were posing a legitimate threat or something, that does happen. But that seems like a pretty large number for just one city. There have been, thousands of complaints in the last 8 years. I think 2,600 complaints, and only like 12 officers were ever disciplined in that time. The biggest punishment was a 40-hour suspension. And despite all these problems, last year, the mayor, the same guy you were talking about, Jacob Frey, he actually increased police funding there by over $8 million. And so not only are these individual officers seemingly not facing many consequences, but the department as a whole isn't either. And so this sort of, starts to give you some context behind, why people are calling for this. In Floyd's case, it does seem sort of like a more rare exception where the officers were fired. And ultimately, since the last time we talked, the other 3 officers involved in his death have been charged now. But that was only after this massive explosion of anger and protests and even rioting. And it's after years and years of abusive cops basically getting away with it, and the department sometimes being rewarded for this kind of stuff. But, there have been other very disturbing stories that have come out of Minneapolis that people are now sort of like remembering with this call to disband the police department. So in 2018, the Tribune had this story where they had obtained this internal city report. So it's an official city document showing that police had been instructing EMS workers to inject people with ketamine, which is a very strong, like, dissociative and sedative drug. It's like a, real powerful downer that I think they first started using in, like, veterinary medicine to, like, tranquilize animals. And in many of these cases, the people who were getting injected with this had committed no crime. They were being detained for some other reason. A lot of cases, they weren't even in an agitated state that would actually justify using a sedative. But for whatever reason, these cops had these medical workers do this anyway. And often over the objections of the people being sedated, like saying, like, hey, man, what are you doing? Like, I don't need that. You don't need to do that to me. But, first of all, of course, it's extremely inappropriate for police to be telling medical workers how to be doing their jobs and what medicine to administer and how much of it. Like, that should not be happening at all. But in a few of these cases, too, these people were injected with so much ketamine that they actually had to be revived, that, like, they were given an overdose and some needed to be, like, intubated. So it became like a very life-threatening situation. And in 2015, the cops did this 62 times where they had medical workers inject people with ketamine. So, that was just in the 1 year. But when they were doing it, especially, they're doing it more. But that's a ton of times to be instructing people to be, sedated like this. And after this Tribune story ran, we can maybe leave it in the show notes. It is really it's a pretty long write-up. It's very much worth reading. But the department had said that it issued an order to have officers never suggest or demand that, EMT workers sedate anybody. So that may have put an end to it. But for all we know, they're still doing this. Like, I haven't seen any further reporting after this. All we got was sort of like their promise that it wouldn't happen again. But they very well could still be doing this. It's not totally unheard of for police or for someone to be sedated in a encounter with police. Sometimes they'll use a benzodiazepine, which is a different kind of sedative. But it is very odd for them to be using ketamine to do this. That's sort of it's a weird thing. Ketamine is also like a recreational drug that people use a lot. It's like big in like the club scene and stuff. But it is a weird thing to be sedating people with. But nonetheless, this type of story, these killings, all the complaints, and this very disturbing kind of thing with the ketamine, like, I think it does give us some context for why people are so angry in Minneapolis and why they're fine. It's not as if the cops killed one guy and now they're just demanding they disband the police department over that. There's like years and years of these kind of stories of people being abused, of the officers being very corrupt and violent that, came before this. And people are saying now that, like, it's beyond reform. Like, we've tried all these changes. We've tried sort of tinkering around the edges, but it's time to just, start over and start fresh. And when you look at all these other cities where we're seeing protests, like, there are similar situations too, and all around the country. I think when you look into local reporting, you can often find similar kind of like messed up stories, like, similar horror stories to the ketamine thing with your own local police departments, especially in larger cities, in New York and Los Angeles and stuff. There's a lot of corruption there. And so I think these kind of stories does give us some context for why we're seeing these protests and this unrest and calls to not only, they're talking about disbanding the Minneapolis police, but all over the country now they're talking about defunding the police. And so that's also like gaining traction, nationwide.
Right. I mean, just these horror stories of Baltimore police officers carrying around fake guns in case they need to plant them on their victims. So many cases now of police being exposed with their own body cameras of planting evidence, some officers multiple times on their victims, planting different kind of drugs and stuff like that. And then in Chicago, where the police, at least at one point, were essentially running like the, Project High Rise's drug trade. I mean, it's insane. And, these two stories that you bring up are just, two stories from the past, 5 years in one not that large city. And so it's not surprising that there's so much anger against, the police. And, that I guess it isn't surprising, as we've had more of this conversation, that the general call of the protest movement has been defund police, because, like just all these abuses, if it happens to you just once, could potentially be life changing. I mean, I don't know how I would feel if I were, walking, maybe jaywalking or doing some kind of minor violation, if that. Or maybe I was just, kind of outside and I had a couple beers, but like I wasn't drunk or anything. And a cop then had me sedated with ketamine. I mean, that would change my entire life. Just the way, how safe you are going anywhere. If the cops could just scoop you up and inject you with a serious drug like this. And so just all these little things that happen in all these cities, none of this, Black Lives Matter and defund police movement that we're seeing now is really surprising. From a libertarian perspective, I guess, I know when we talk about Black Lives Matter, there's a lot of communists in that movement. And there's a lot of Medicare for all and a lot of government spending. However, this time it seems like the general call to me is to take the money from the police and put it towards other community organizations. And so that seems like a relatively reasonable thing to do, and a step towards de-arming police. I know there's other like bills and movements put forward centered around qualified immunity. I talked to that with Scott Horton about that on the 500th episode of the show. Getting rid of all these weapons from the 1033 program where, the cops have tanks and sniper rifles. They have these tear gas launchers, where they're able to lob these things like 100 or so feet, or at least, right? And so apparently the cops don't know how to use them. I think this was a protest in Buffalo, but who knows? I watched so many of these where they actually fired the tear gas behind the protesters, and then they told the protesters to disperse. Well, if there's tear gas, they were boxed in by the tear gas and the cops. The cops start advancing on them and pushing them with their bikes. And so they apparently don't even know how to use the equipment that they're given. They can't even use it to properly disperse this protest. It's shocking, what's going on with the police right now.
Yeah. I saw a very harrowing clip where this guy, it was a protester. He was, he was trash talking the cop, to be sure, but from a safe distance. He wasn't posing a clear threat. And I watched the police officer raise his tear gas gun and shoot a canister right in the guy's head. Just shot it right in his face. He's watched it bounce off his skull. And then the clip ends after that point. I don't know what happened to that man. But like, yeah, they, you were talking about them not knowing how to use it. And I think that's probably true. But I think they know how to misuse it as well to, really hurt people with these things.
Right.
And as you were saying, there's all kinds of other things, beyond, defunding or disbanding police departments. That's like a radical solution that I'm not always against. Like, I think I am totally open to those ideas. But, you mentioned, ending the 1033 programs to demilitarize. We could end the war on drugs and civil asset forfeiture, mandatory minimum sentences. Could abolish or reform plea bargains, making personnel records totally public and transparent, qualified immunity, you mentioned that, disempowering police unions. There's all kinds of things that could be done. I know they've tried these things in some areas, like in Minneapolis, where they're saying, we give up, we can't try this anymore. But like I would like to see these sort of ideas be tried everywhere. And some ideas like making department funding dependent on like performance and conduct reviews, where you leave it up to like a city board to like approve the funding, and they have to review their conduct and stuff. Like I would like to see more things like that done as well, in addition to the move to try to defund and abolish.
Right. Yeah. If you know that your department's funding is going to depend on you not pissing people off so much that they're willing to take their time and go down there and say that, this officer injected my son with ketamine when he didn't need it, that you're going to have to approach things a little bit differently. You won't be able to act quite so recklessly. So, exactly. Yeah, even small steps like that could be huge. And, look, again, libertarians, I know that there's a lot more to the Black Lives Matter movement that you might not all agree with, when it comes to communism or some of the privileged stuff. But I do think that the general crux of the protest right now is centered around police. Oh, another big one is getting cops out of schools, which yes. I'm highly on board with too. And so a lot of really, really workable stuff coming out of the movement right now. And I know it's easy to just, because you're going to try to be friendly and somebody's, going to call you a racist. Don't, go run and hide and, turn into Trump because somebody called you a racist. Be a big boy. We get called names sometimes. That's part of being a libertarian. Get over it. And, just realize that the people are talking about defunding police departments, demilitarizing police departments, getting police out of school. This is huge. So there's a lot of positives here. One, I guess, more story we should get to today, Will, because it is really could be significant, I guess. And I think the reaction definitely is too. And that is a decision by Trump. And it seems to have come at least in part for, mainly from Trump, that we are going to be withdrawing some troops from Germany. So do you have some details on this?
Yeah. And it's, we've been talking a lot about domestic news lately, and I know the show is foreign policy focused, but we also talk about just the news and important stories. So I think it is important to cover some of these domestic stories. And, there are tie-ins with, the militarization of police and, our foreign policy and these 1033 programs and stuff. So, but yeah, I'm happy to talk about some foreign stuff too now. So I think it was Friday, last Friday, you had a report in the Wall Street Journal. I think they were the first to mention this, but then Reuters also had a follow-up where they kind of corroborated some of the stuff, saying that a big troop withdrawal was now in the works, reducing the number of permanent troops we have stationed in Germany. And reportedly, this would involve 10,000 soldiers, and we would be bringing down the total troop number in Germany down to 25,000. And the troops that we'll be removing, I think it's 9,500 actually, it's just shy of 10,000. We'd be spreading those out to Poland and a few other allied countries, and then some of them would be sent home, apparently, according to the reports. And whichever official that gave this information to Reuters, he said that this is a result of like months of planning by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. And he made sure to say that this has nothing to do with like the ongoing tension between the U.S. and Berlin over Germany not contributing enough to NATO. Because under NATO guidelines, like each member state is supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, which I guess is to kind of ensure that countries aren't just like freeloading and they don't just expect others to come to their rescue and not put any of their own, resources into their own self-defense. And I guess also to ensure that like they can come to others' defense if needed to, because it's a mutual defense alliance. But Germany has been falling short of this 2% threshold for quite a while. Like I think pretty consistently they spend like 1.2% of their GDP on defense. And so Trump and other U.S. officials have been like really haranguing them over this for a while now, over not spending enough on NATO. And actually the recently replaced U.S. ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, had made several threats to withdraw troops over this whole NATO thing, the spending. He had written op-eds in German newspapers, like in the German language, saying that Berlin is undermining NATO. And he's even gotten into it with like German MPs, like gotten into arguments with them, which is kind of bizarre. Like I don't know, just trying to imagine like another country's ambassador doing that here, trying to like dictate U.S. policies and like writing in our press, trying to agitate against our policies, and getting into spats with lawmakers. That is kind of outrageous. And on Grenell's way out, actually, one MP there had said that he, quote, issued threats as if he were representing a hostile power. And that's largely in reference to Grinnell threatening that we're going to withdraw troops if you don't, pay more, spend more on your defense or on your military, I should say. And so this official who talked to Reuters says it has nothing to do with this ongoing dispute, this troop withdrawal. I'm not buying that. Like, I tend to think that this has something to do with that. And actually, the Wall Street Journal, too, they cited another official who acknowledges that that's totally what's driving this, that, it's the NATO thing. And it's also, he mentioned the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a big gas pipeline that would bring Russian gas straight to Germany, which Washington doesn't like because, it's beneficial to the Russians. It gives them access to the European market. And so that also, there may be other things driving this as well, in addition to the NATO thing. But I do think this withdrawal is supposed to be part of our, sort of ongoing spat with Germany. Now, apparently, though, they're not only going to reduce the troop level to 25,000 there, they're actually going to cap it at that. Or at least I'd seen some discussion of this from officials in the reports, that they're actually going to set a maximum number we can have in Germany to 25,000. And that I found was kind of interesting because it would create some weird practical and logistical issues, because a lot of American soldiers pass through German bases, on their way to other parts of the world. And so at any given time, you might have 50,000 U.S. troops stationed there in Germany temporarily because they're on their way to somewhere else. So if they were to really enforce this 25,000 soldier cap, that could potentially disrupt other deployments, which, to me isn't necessarily a bad thing at all. That might actually be good if they do that. I'm not totally confident how strictly they're going to enforce that cap, but, just if they did, that would be a potential, implication of that. And, even though some of these soldiers are going to other countries, I am, of course, glad to see some of them come home. I don't think it's not our job. It's not the U.S.'s job to defend Europe. It's not the U.S.'s taxpayers' burden to bear to defend this whole continent. They shouldn't be footing the bill for that. So I do think that, insofar as some of these soldiers will come home, I do think that is overall a positive thing.
Yeah. So, Will, when I saw this story, I immediately thought that there's going to be some chat marks on Twitter tweeting that this is obviously just Trump, taking orders from Vladimir Putin. And what do you know? I was right. So I tweeted it out. And then 2 hours later, I just searched Putin in Twitter and I saw some interesting tweets here. One from Alexander Chalupa, interesting name, right? Donald Trump is working through Putin's to-do list at a speed fast these days, which is interesting because he's withdrawing from treaties that Putin wants to be in. Michael McFall suggests that Donald Trump and Putin have been talking a lot these days, and possibly if they had talked about this. And so maybe suggesting that Donald Trump is taking orders. Christopher Orr, who is a writer at The Atlantic, says the same thing. But to really top it off, Will, I have one of our favorites, Liz Cheney, daughter of the former vice president. Apparently, warmonger does pass down through the bloodline, everyone. So if your father is a warmonger, good chance, especially if you're a daughter, that you're going to be too. But she says that this is a dangerously misguided policy. The United States abandons allies, withdraws our forces, and retreats within our borders. The cause of freedom on which our nation was founded and our security depends will be in peril. We will be in peril. The core of our security and everything our country is founded on is in peril because these 9,500 troops, some of which are just going towards other countries, potentially closer to Russia's border, is putting our country in peril. Do you have any words?
Yeah, I guess I could come up with a few. This is clearly just we've talked so much about the insane hysteria over anything that has to do with Russia or Putin. And there is this sort of narrative that the Russians are seeking to invade Eastern Europe or the Baltic states or something, which is just there's no real proof for that. There's no evidence for this whatsoever. This is purely just a comic book kind of narrative here. Look, if you look at German opinion polls, the German people are not that diehard in favor of American soldiers being there. I know, yes, a couple conservative German MPs came out and wrote some op-eds saying that oh no, that would be very regrettable. We welcome American soldiers here. But the overall German populace, I don't think is convinced that that's the only thing standing between them and Putin's, boot is, these American soldiers. And really, it's funny if you look at we were just talking about how Germany is reluctant to spend more on its defense. And you would think that if Germany was so convinced that the Russians were this dire threat, wouldn't they be a little more like willing to spend more on their defense budget? Like I know that they did commit to I think their defense minister in Germany committed to hitting that 2% threshold, but he said they wouldn't do it until 2031. And so this is obviously not like a real big priority for them. They're not feeling like they're under threat. And I think it's a similar kind of thing if you look at the defense spending of some of these other Baltic countries too, that like, I don't think they're really they're not that convinced that the Russians are rolling in the tanks anytime soon. It's just kind of just a hysterical thing that like you're going to hear from, like you mentioned I don't know if it was the Atlantic news publication or the Atlantic Council, because I know the Atlantic Council is like NATO's think tank. And this whole idea is very popular. I'm sure it's also popular.
It's a publication.
Okay.
But, yeah.
But I think similarly, though, it's also popular. That's a similarly popular idea there, too, where it's sort of this. In fact, there is like a name for this Atlanticist sort of like take on things, this very pro-NATO idea that like, we have to protect Europe and the world from the Russians, as if there's some sort of like resurgence of the USSR or something, that they're going to come and try to rebuild the Warsaw Pact or something. It's just it's really hysterical and outrageous. And if you look at like, I think the defense spending of some of those European countries is a good indication that they're not that worried about a Russian invasion anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, just the hysteria around Russia is crazy. I mean, last week, apparently Vladimir Putin is the hero of this country, funding and, instigating these Black Lives Matter protests, forcing us to have a very needed conversation about race. And then this week he's the villain by, ordering Donald Trump to remove our troops from Germany. So it's just it's crazy how these stories come and go, and how when I guess before the protests were something that we all agreed was a great thing, that they were being blamed on Russia, but then as soon as it was something that everybody supported, then that claim completely faded away. But now Russia is behind this. It really is, just seems on the part of a lot of these people, either, I think in Alexandra Chalupa's case to, have some personal motives there. But some of these other people, I think, are maybe at this point like kind of in a delusional state, and they really do see Russia everywhere. It seems very unhealthy to me. I'm getting concerned about them. I suppose, one place it's, different for us, Will, is, for me, I'm almost 30, so I guess there were a few, early days of my life where the USSR did exist, but not a single day of my life that I remember did this exist. When I was in elementary school, you would know a map was old when it had the USSR on it. I'm not like, that's how you knew the map was outdated. It didn't say Russia, it was a giant blob that said the USSR was a thing that didn't exist anymore. And yet, all these people, I guess, had that, kind of Cold War fear conditioning ingrained in them, and just are so willing to blame everything on Putin and Russia aggressing. It's something to see and something to worry about, especially since, Trump taking this step. It is, maybe a small step, like you said, bringing a few troops home and capping the number of troops in Germany at 25,000. But it is a step in the right direction, and it's just unfortunate that the one thing the president does right, they can't even leave it alone. They have to make the most absurd claim that he is a puppet of a foreign government, not even a foreign government, our main nuclear rival, that he is a puppet of their leader anytime he does anything that de-escalates our foreign policy. So I don't know. I guess I'll let you wrap up with whatever you have left to add.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think this is a point we've made, I think, consistently all throughout this whole hysteria over Russia since the whole Russia Gate scandal in 2016. That this is going to be a weapon for some time to come now to box in. I don't think not only Trump, it's going to be future presidents too, that they're going to continue using this narrative where anytime they try to do anything that we would consider positive, withdrawing troops from Syria, anything like that, or even Afghanistan, I think they claimed that this was somehow to, in a move sure to benefit Putin. That's sort of how they frame everything. So it is something we really have to pay attention to. This is like a very potent weapon that is now deployed for the long term against anyone who's going to try to do anything against the empire, that it's all in favor of Moscow. So, I think that is an important point to keep in mind.
All right, Will, tell people where to find your work.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, I'm a staff writer at RT. I've done a lot of writing at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and Consortium News. And if you really do want to find the stuff that I'm writing at RT, because I don't get bylines there, check my Twitter at WKP ANCAP.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle.